Morning, everyone. My name's Nick. Jesus warns us about placing our faith in things that a moth can destroy, that rust can corrode, that thieves can steal. And boy, have these last 2 weeks been a lesson in that, as we've seen people's homes just utterly destroyed. I want to thank you, Mercy Commons, for your generosity. We said that we would match your gift up to $10,000 for the fire relief. How close do you think we got? Who wants to know? You want to know? This is how far we got. Congratulations, well done. You guys have been generous. That means that we will be distributing close to $20,000 to churches and organizations and partners that we have direct relationship and faith in with regards to fire relief. So well done, well done. It's such a pleasure to preach about encountering God through generosity from a general place of strength in this community. And it isn't just calamity. It isn't just a market crash in 2008. It isn't just the fact that our possessions lose value. It's also the fact that we get bored with our possessions. I remember obsessing and saving for something that I am actually embarrassed that I ever had. And one of those things, way back, this was like 15 years ago, was a Bluetooth earpiece. Do you guys remember that? And I remember researching, and I remember saving my money, and I remember getting it, and I remember looking like such an idiot walking around with that Bluetooth earpiece in my ear. And so it isn't just the fact that when we focus our lives around these treasures, there are things that we thought were going to be so cool that we just hope no one even remembers that we had those things. That fire, that moth, that rust, that thieves can destroy. And this morning, we're talking about encountering God through financial generosity. And there's a number of reasons and ways in which we encounter God through being financially generous. And one of the key ways is that we get to image God, because God himself is a giving God. He gave us the earth. He gave us Jesus to walk on this earth so that we knew what living in relationship with God through the Spirit was like. Jesus gave his life for us so that we could have eternal life with the Father. And when he ascended, Jesus gave his Spirit to us so that we could image him and go into the world and give what we have received. But this morning, I want to focus on two kind of key things that happen when we give ourselves to Spirit-empowered generosity, especially financial generosity, and that is that it rescues us from anxiety and from pride. And I'm going to be reading out of Luke 12, and basically kind of sitting in Luke 12 for the most of this morning. But Jesus has already spoken to his disciples. There's such a big crowd gathered that it says they began to trample each other. He begins speaking to his disciples, and this big crowd draws near, and then the Pharisees come to hear, and then he begins to talk to the Pharisees. And so he's in the middle of what he is saying to this large crowd in Luke 12, verse 13. Someone from the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." Jesus said to him, "Man, who appointed me as judge or referee between you and your brother?" And Jesus said to them, to the people that are listening for his response, "Watch out, guard yourselves against all kinds of greed. After all, one's life isn't determined by one's possessions, even when someone is very wealthy." So I want you to picture this. This man is so anxious and so obsessed that he interrupts Jesus' sermon so that Jesus can be used in order for him to get what he wants. How many of you have been in that place where it doesn't seem to matter what is happening in your life, but the financial stress and pressure and anxiety is just so overwhelming that everything around you seems to trigger that? Even this morning, you might be in that place. where you're kind of hearing, no, 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 because you're, well, how am I going to pay that bill? What is going to happen in my life? How am I going to send my kids to school? Anxiety is a complex thing, and I want to say that right now. Oftentimes, when we experience anxiety, we experience shame on top of anxiety because there's a sense in which we know we shouldn't be experiencing this. I know that anxiety has many kind of tentacles to it. And I want to just pray right now so that those of you that are in places where you know that anxiety is kind of one of the things that you battle with, that you don't leave this morning with a sense of like, oh, great. I went to church and they told me not to be anxious. That really helps. That's like telling an angry guy not to be mad, right? But hopefully through His Spirit, God will be able to do something. So Father, I come before you this morning and I want to thank you that it is your desire that we live in freedom. It is your desire that we live with hope, and not in a vain freedom and hope, but a hope and a freedom that is purchased by and delivered through you, Jesus. And so I pray for my friends, and I pray in the name of Jesus that you would block the voice of the accuser, and that we would hear words of hope and freedom this morning. He's not asking Jesus for perspective. He's asking Jesus to give a directive. I want you to do this. And Jesus basically calls him greedy. I'm like, well, I don't know that he's greedy. He's just asking for the inheritance to be split. More than likely, this was the younger brother. And in first century Judaism, what would happen is the oldest son would get 2/3 of the inheritance, and the youngest sons would get what was left over. And that seems a little unfair unless you're the oldest, which actually, that's not such a bad deal. But for him, it was a bad deal, and all he could think about was that my life is going to be sorted out. This whole thing will be fixed if I can just get Jesus to tell him to divide my inheritance. If I can just get the right amount of money, then I'm not going to be anxious. Augustine says this: anger, anxiety, worry, and depression are not the problem. They are simply the smoke rising from the altars that we build to our idols. Follow the smoke, and you'll find the idol that needs to be removed. And I want to say this with as much love as I can. You cannot separate fear from anxiety because the one drives the other. I want you to ask yourself, have you ever seen an unafraid, anxious person? And so the whole thing is that's actually what gets inside us, is this fear and anxiety that drives it. Now, let me say this. Fear and anxiety are God-given emotions and responses. When Karen drives with me, she has fear and anxiety because she thinks we're going to die. So she's obviously a person of low faith, in terms of, I'm kidding. Fear and anxiety keeps us alive. We know I shouldn't do this thing. This will probably end badly for me. But when fear and anxiety takes over, it is an absolutely debilitating thing. Jeremy Stanley says this: which of these statements cause more anxiety for you? There is no God, or there is no money? Which of those statements right now, as you sit there, are like, which one would actually cause me more fear or anxiety? When Jesus carries on and he tells this story in response to this man's anxiety and in response to the parable. He says to his disciples, therefore I tell you, do not be anxious about your life, what you will eat, nor about your body, what you will put on. For life is more than food, and the body more than clothing. Again, he's talking about your basic needs and essentials. Consider the ravens. They neither sow nor reap, and they neither have storehouses nor barns, and yet God feeds them. Of how much more value are you than the birds? And which of you, by being anxious, can add a single hour to the span of his life? If then you are not able to do as small a thing as that, why are you anxious about the rest? Consider the lilies, see how they grow. They neither toil nor spin. Yet I tell you, even Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed like one of these. Anxiety has the absolute opposite outcome of what we think it does. It shortens our life and it robs us of peace and joy. And Jesus points that out very, very clearly. Fearing tomorrow robs our energy and our faith for the energy that we could implement for wise strategies when it comes to dealing with finances, to minimize potential anxious situations. Now, have you ever seen God feeding a raven? Anyone seen that? What does God do? He provides the means for a raven to eat. And so there is a sense in which when we are super anxious, we don't look around us to see the ways that God has provided for us to be able to be fed. Most of us think, okay, I'm not going to be anxious and God is going to take care of it in some supernatural way. No, God has created you with an ability to work, you with an ability to save, you with an ability to make those wise decisions, empowered by the Spirit to be able to do that. And so this isn't some sense of God will always, in a supernatural way, do something for you in the financial arena. Now, Nick, I have had experiences supernaturally. Me too. I have. But I don't rest on those things. I rest on the fact that God is my provider. In the same way that He's provided for the ravens and the sparrows, in the same way that the lilies grow, God will provide for me. But when I'm tired, and when I'm expending energy on some devastating what if, I cannot focus my attention on the fact that He's a good Father, that He's Jehovah Jireh. I have this intensely powerful and vivid picture of what my future will look like. And that just pushes in and it clouds any sense of peace. Wow, thanks, Nick. We're like, what do we do with that? Well, let me say this, and this is counterculture. Financial generosity is a tool that God uses to break you out of anxiety. Because what you're saying is, no, I'm not going to play the hoarding game. I'm not going to believe that the solution to this problem is for me to run around like a chicken without my head off, with my head cut off, and actually do everything that I can. But Jesus is hitting two major lies here. Lots of money will enable you to experience joy, peace, fulfillment, and purpose. And the other lie is that lots of money will prevent calamity, pain, and suffering. He's hitting those two right now because he goes back to the man and he tells him this parable in Luke 12, verse 16. He told them a parable. A certain rich man's land produced a bountiful crop, and he said to himself, "What will I do?" Now I want you to focus on I, me, okay? What will I do? I have no place to store my harvest. Then he thought, here's what I'll do. I'll tear down my barns and I'll build bigger ones. That's where I'll store all of my grain and goods. I'll say to myself, you have stored up plenty of goods, enough for several years. Take it easy, eat, drink, and enjoy yourself. But God says to him, fool, tonight you will die. Now, who will get those things that you've prepared for yourself? This is the way it will be for those who hoard things for themselves, but aren't rich towards God. Now, here's a man who's had a bumper crop. This is actually quite a selfish decision. He is not thinking about people that have not had a bumper crop. He's not even thinking of potentially, maybe I could be generous with the extra crop that I've received. He's thinking, what am I going to do in order to cement my future? Now, in those days, his decision to hoard is going to affect the poor in his community because it will further entrench his power role and it will provide him a sense of pride, and people will have to come to him begging for food. Now, he's not just putting grains in the barn. It says, for all his plentiful possessions and for the grain. I did some research. When we first moved here in 2002, I was shocked at the fact that garages were not places where cars were kept. Garages were places where you kept your stuff. I was further shocked to find out that that's not enough. That we now pay for places to store the stuff that doesn't fit in our garage. We have, in the United States, 2.6 billion square feet of storage space. Okay, that's 9 square miles. That's double the size of LA County. If you put all of the public storage units together, it would be double the size of LA County, half the size of Orange County. In fact, if we use that measure, it means that every single human being in the United States has 8 square feet of storage space. That's how much storage space we have. Those are the size of our barns. Now, if you have a public storage unit, this is not about that, okay? It's like, this is not about that. This is not about shame or any of those kinds of things. It is indicative of our society with regards to how normal it is to keep things that we don't need. Now, my wife and daughters are part of, what's this group called? This Buy Nothing group. And I love it. It's the idea of actually saying, hey, I have this, who wants it? Let's share it. If someone wants to be part of that, they can ask Karen. Because I have a lot of stuff that I want to get rid of, I know. I will say to my soul, soul, you have ample goods laid up for you. Relax, eat, and be merry. Pride is what makes us focus on ourselves. If anxiety makes us hoard, pride also makes us hoard and avoid the question of generosity. I remember I said, I want you to find me an anxious person that's not fearful. I want you to find me a proud person that's not greedy. Those two things connect. Have you seen a humble, greedy person? Generally not. You also can't separate joy from generosity, because I've never met a grumpy, generous person either. And so what Jesus is pushing us towards is that if we believe that we alone are the ones that are responsible for the success, and that it belongs to me, I'm not even going to ask the question, how do I steward what God has given me? So if I'm anxious, I'm going to hold on to everything because I'm afraid. If I'm proud, I'm going to believe that it's because of what I did that I have the right to determine what happens to the stuff. And Jesus is saying, no, that's not what it means to be set free free into joy out of anxiety and pride. Now, I want to give some 5 rules for financial freedom. And before I do those, I want to play a video that shows the difference between 20 years ago and now. Because many of you will say that, well, I'm not materialistic. I don't have a public storage unit. I get rid of a lot of my stuff. And so I think I'm good. And this is the transition that we've come to. The Super Bowl's coming up. This is a Super Bowl ad that I noticed.
Stuff. We love stuff. And there's some really great stuff out there. But I doubt that any of us will look back on our lives and think, I wish I'd gotten a slightly sportier SUV, bought an even thinner TV, or found a trendier scent. I wish I'd discovered a crunchier chip, found a lighter light beer, or had an even smarter smartphone. Do you think any of us will look back in our lives and regret the things we didn't buy? Or the places we didn't go? Stuff.
I hope you see the irony, right? So there's a sense in which we kind of have elevated into a new level because we aren't after stuff, we're after experiences. And yet it's the same idea. Save more on the stuff that really matters. And so when we look at our lives, we can't just look at it from the public storage perspective. We've got to look at it as what do I think is giving my life meaning? What are those things, whether it's the thin TV, the lighter light beer, or whether it's that experience? And am I approaching my generosity with an understanding that none of it belongs to me anyway? And the first thing I need to do is go to the Father and say, what do you want me to do with these things? So it's 5 simple rules for financial freedom. And I'm going to go quickly here. And the one, and you might be surprised by this, the one is earn as much as you can. That's so capitalistic of you. No, it isn't. It's scriptural. I can't even go to the parable of the talents, where the manager gives a certain amount of money to people, and he comes back, and what does he expect? He expects a return. Now, maximizing our skill with the ability to earn as much as we can is not unbiblical. Because the next thing is really what we need to understand. We earn as much as we can, we consume the least that we can. So we earn as much as we can. In terms of if you're business owners, people, planet, then profits. Earn the least amount that you can. And that includes your experiences, that includes the things that you want to buy, that includes all of those things. Do I really need this? Am I consuming just because I can? Now, most of us ask the question, can I afford this? And we find ways in which we can afford it. Maybe the question we should be asking is, does God want me to have this? And most of you are like, that's a bait and switch, because God will always say no. No, he won't. But I'll get there in step 5, okay? Earn as much as you can, consume the least amount possible, and that's only possible when our satisfaction is centered through him. Give generously. Give generously because we understand that this money does not belong to me. It ultimately belongs to him. Own nothing and owe nothing. Now, what do you mean? So this is what I mean by own nothing. I want people to have nice things, but I also don't want them to be owned by those nice things. And so there's a massive difference between you owning something and that thing owning you. And when you own something, you're unlikely to let someone else borrow it. So let me give you an example. You want to buy some nice golf. Who plays golf here? No one? Okay. There we go. Okay. Wow. She put your hand up pretty quickly. This might be for you, Seth. You play golf. You're like, man, I want to buy a nice new set of golf clubs. I have the money. God has been generous. And I think I'm going to go ahead and do that. And you buy these golf clubs and you treat them like a child. No one can touch them. No one can borrow them. Who owns who? Right? The golf clubs own you. Now, if you buy a set of golf clubs, you buy an expensive set of golf clubs, and you're like, hey man, it's not mine. You want to borrow it? Go ahead and borrow it. And I can see some of you already cringing. You're like, oh, what if they break it? That is the point. That is the point. What if they break it? What if this possession does not return to me in the way in which I wanted it to return to me? That'll say a lot about whether you own that thing or that thing owns you. Owe nothing. This is obvious. I don't want to go into it. But debt is something that makes us incredibly anxious. Debt is something that makes our world smaller because our ability to give is directly tied to the fact that we are servicing another debt. And until we are free from that kind of debt, we won't be able to make the kinds of decisions that God wants us to make. I can hardly make ends meet. What do you mean look for opportunities to be generous? So I want to encourage you to look at that specifically. And we have lots of, not just courses, but resources to be able to help you with that. And then the last one, and this is what I enjoy the most, is if you've earned the most you can, if you consume the least you can, if you give generously, own nothing and owe nothing, celebrate life. Then you can do so without anxiety or without pride. You want to go on that vacation? Go on that vacation. You want to buy those golf clubs? Buy those golf clubs. You want to eat at a fancy restaurant and pay $40 for a little scallop that big? More power to you. You know what I mean? But if all of those things are in order, then we don't have to be riddled with guilt when we celebrate the things that God has given us. Why? Because once those 4 things are dealt with, we recognize they aren't ours anyway. They're His. And His, as a good Father, He's created this earth for us to enjoy. Experiences, food, concerts, all those kinds of things are not bad in and of themselves. As long as those 4 things are in order, we're able to say, God, I want to be able to do this. I want to trust you to be able to do that. And I want to do it without guilt or shame. Got me? Yeah. Weston, why don't you come up here? One of the the ways that we're looking at our encounter series is to ask people, how has this specific encounter, as we've gone through the scripture, solitude, prayer, singing, gifts, and generosity, how is generosity a way in which you've been able to encounter God?
Hard to choose. Man, I actually got really emotional thinking about this week because I thought back to like our wedding, and throughout life, I haven't been impacted by the generosity of really anyone outside of the church, but the number of times I've been impacted by generosity through people in the church has been, I can't even count them, but like thinking about our wedding, our entire wedding was $4,000. We were totally busted. We had like $20. I think after our wedding, we lived off of Target gift cards for like a couple weeks before I started my first job. And it was just like weeks and weeks of people pouring out their generosity financially with their time to make our wedding happen, to make it incredible. So that's one way. The other way that I think has impacted me like throughout my life is just watching my dad be generous. He, regardless of the season that we were in financially, he would always give in abundance. And he wasn't like the most generous person to other people, but the way he gave to the church was, it made a huge impact on me. I remember watching him one day write a check, and I was like, really, we give that much money? Like, we can't even afford these other things, and we're giving that much money. And I've just seen, throughout the years, just the way that he's blessed my family, and to today, sorry.
No, don't be sorry at all. How's that affected you, Weston?
Like this? But no, it's impacted, the way that Grace and I use our finances. Over the last like 3 or 4 years, I was laid off 3 times, and I had a new job lined up before I even finished my other one, and I was given, these substantial exit packages for being laid off, and I just knew every time I got them that this money isn't necessarily for me. And so we would always ask, who is this money supposed to be for? Because we don't need it. God has been very generous to us. I already have a job lined up. There's not going to be like this long period of not making money. And to be honest, it's so much fun, right? Because it's way more fun to give things than it is to get them, for sure. So,
awesome. One of the amazing things is being part of the leadership of a church. You get to be involved in a lot of the anonymous giving that happens through people in this church to other people in this church. And for me, it's so exciting just to deliver that envelope and say, hey, someone wanted you to have this. And what happens in them, there's just this explosion of like, God has seen me in this. And both people are experiencing an encounter because you've chosen to be generous in that way. Then Weston, last question is, why is giving to the local church important? Why can't we just give to people as we're led in that sense?
I think we can do that, but I look at the passage in Acts where it talks about kind of in the early church, everyone gave to each other out of, and no one lacked anything. And we can do that to a certain extent with people in the church, but like the leaders of our local church, the church that we attend, are much closer to those needs and those challenges. Also, I believe that like you and Vic and Mitch are the ones who have been entrusted to steward those resources. So it's not only that it's like there's a model in the Bible that is clearly communicated, but there's those tangible ways of like that's just what you get. You guys devote your time and effort to making the best use of those resources. So it's not that we don't do it outside of that, but that's the first and primary way that we give.
Great. Yeah. One of the things I want to say about Weston is him and I were chatting. I don't want to embarrass him, but one of the things that he's seen in his life is a multiplication of generosity. As he's been generous to someone, he's seen that, what is the weird Starbucks thing, the pay it back? Yeah, paid forward, paid back, whatever. But But he's seen that in this community. As he's been generous to someone in the community, that person has been generous to someone else in the community, and it's just created a snowball, which is phenomenal. Thanks, bro. Appreciate you. So ultimately, what does it mean to engage in spirit-empowered generosity? 1 Chronicles 29, verse 12 says this. David is talking to God after the people have given themselves to a wildly generous outpouring of their wealth for the building of the temple. And you are the source of wealth and honor, and you rule over all, and in your hand are strength and might, and it is in your power to magnify and strengthen all. And now, our God, we thank you and praise your glorious name. Who am I, and who are my people, that we should be able to offer so willingly, since everything comes from you? We have been given, since everything comes from you, we have given you that which comes from your own hand. What David is acknowledging, and what I'm trying to badly say, is that we are literally just a conduit of the grace that God has given us back to the people and back to our world. Once we grab that idea that this doesn't belong to me, because I've grabbed the idea that I don't belong to myself, I belong to Him, this becomes easier. Not easy, it becomes easier. Someone that has gripped this reality that says, who am I and who are my people that we should be able to offer so willingly, then a steward mentality begins to seep into our minds, and then anxiety and pride is dealt with as a secondary function. We don't even need to go after anxiety or pride, because if we understand that we are His and we belong to Him, that gets dealt with on its own. So how are we called to be generous financially? Well, first and foremost, we're called to be generous and provide for our family. That is our key responsibility, is to make sure that our family is taken care of. In the New Testament, time and time again, Paul says that the obligation of a family is to their blood family. And when he talks about widows, he basically says the reason why we take care of widows is because they have no family to take care of them. The second place is our local church and our giving with regards to our local church. The third place is to our brothers and sisters in the family of God. And James and Peter talks about this in terms of our brothers and sisters. And then to our neighbors and to our world, like you guys have in terms of the LA fires. And so what does giving to our local church need to look like? I would say that giving to our local church, we aren't going to go into the details of how much. But I will say this. Jesus says this. How terrible for you, Pharisees, you give 1/10 of your mint, rue, and garden herbs, and all those kinds of things while neglecting justice and love for God. And that's generally where we end that. And people that have this very strong theology about the tithe is not New Testament, that's where they end that sentence. But the sentence continues, doesn't it? And what does the sentence continue to say? These you ought to have done without neglecting the others. And so I want to say that every time Jesus spoke about something, He didn't lower the bar. Every time Jesus spoke about something, He raised the bar. And He says, great, you haven't killed anybody with your hands, you haven't murdered anybody, but if you hate someone, you've murdered them. You haven't committed adultery with a woman in a physical sense, but you lust after her. So every time Jesus is raising the bar. Regular, sacrificial, and cheerful giving is what we long to see in our church because it is a weapon against pride and anxiety. So what does it mean to be regular? Monthly, weekly, quarterly, whatever time it is, make it regular, not sporadic. I know some of you guys are paid weekly, some of you guys are paid monthly, some of you guys are in businesses where maybe you're a real estate agent or maybe you're an entrepreneur where you get big injections of cash and then nothing for months. What I do want to say is this. Not deciding is deciding. And so I would recommend with regards to regularity, it means if you've decided to do something regularly, it means that you are intentional. I want to say this. We had a couple, they were massively in debt with student debt. And we were talking to them about finances and how they were going to get out of it. And their perspective was like, oh, we can't afford to give anything to the church. And I said, okay, Just start the lowest bar. Start with something and start with it being regular. And you will see God's kindness flow to you. Not because of that, but because ultimately, when you do that, you're going to have to pray, oh God, oh God, oh God, help me. Karen and I have seen the faithfulness of God time and time and time again, not only in our lives, through our lives, but in the lives of community, where God has been so incredibly, not just faithful, but generous to his people. Giving to your local church should be regular. Giving to your local church needs to be sacrificial. And that means it's a reordering of your financial world. In order to be intentional, it means that you've got to budget. It means that you've got to get out of debt. It means that you sacrifice in one area so that you're not just giving out of a sense of your disposable income. So for the longest time, for 12 years, Karen and I made a decision. And this is a budgeting decision, not a giving decision, but this is how it works. We were not going to go out to eat because a higher value for us was going on vacation with our girls. And so those are the kinds of decisions that you make. Vic was saying to me the other day, I'm going to expose him. He said, yeah, I know you pinch pennies, you know. And I'm like, yeah, I pinch pennies so that I can be generous in other ways, you know. And one of the reasons that we need to be intentional and sacrificial about giving is if we just let it happen, it's never going to happen. But if we actually say, you know what, I don't need this. I'm going to pinch a penny here because I can get the lower quality golf club, Seth. I can, you know. I mean, how much better is it really going to make me, you know? And okay. So, he's bought into the advertising, right? But the question is like, do I really need that? Actually, if I adjust my life, I'm able to give more in these areas. God calls us to be generous with others. God calls us for this act to be a worshiping act, to bring our first fruits, not the dirty change and lint from our pockets. It's the best of what we have, not the leftovers. And when you're sacrificial with your giving, that act is actually saying that I trust you and not my ability to work or to save. That I recognize that everything I have, my time, my talents, and my treasures belongs to you, and that I am a steward of it. That's what it means to be regular and sacrificial. And then finally, be cheerful. 2 Corinthians 9 verse 6 says, this is what I mean. The one who sows a small number of seeds will also reap a small crop. And the one who sows a generous amount of seeds will also reap a generous crop. Everyone should give whatever they have decided in their heart, and they shouldn't give with hesitation or pressure, because God loves a cheerful giver. Now, I want to go back to what I said at the beginning. I challenge you to find me a cheerful giver that is proud or anxious. That's my challenge. That we actually, when we give to the local church, when we give to our family, when we give to our brothers and sisters around the world, and when we give to our world, when we do it cheerfully, there's a sense in which I cannot do that with a sense of pride. Why? It's not mine. I'm giving you something that God has given to me for a time, and then I'm giving it to you. I can't do it with a sense of anxiousness if I'm cheerful, because I've heard God that He will provide for all of my needs. I'm able to do that. I get to multiply my seed. Now, this is not bread. Paul talks later on, this is sowing seed, and seed is always a sense of sowing. And Paul says, and God will help you decide, identify what is your seed and what is your bread. And we're not asking anyone to sow their bread. We're asking people to sow their seed. Band, you can come up. If you're a visitor here, obviously this is about our local church. If you're a visitor here, you might be thinking, this is why I never come to church. Because all they talk about is money. And if you hang around later on, you'll hear, actually, we very seldom talk about money. Now, we do that because we talk about money because we believe it's a discipleship tool. It isn't out of necessity. And I can say this, standing here as representatives of the leadership of the church, is that we are in a good financial position. Now, I hesitate to say that. That makes me anxious to say. Because what am I expecting the response to be? Oh, they don't need it. I'll give it to someone else who needs it, or a higher rate of return. And that's why I want you to look at those things. Am I providing for and being faithful and generous to my family? Am I being faithful and generous to the local body that God has called me to be in? Am I being faithful and generous to brothers and sisters around the world that call on the name of Jesus? And am I being faithful and generous in giving to my neighbors and to the world? You know, the gospel is economic in the terms that it uses. The good news is about a debt that has been forgiven. The New Testament says that we have been ransomed. In other words, we have been kidnapped by sin and self, and that ransom is what Jesus paid to set us free. The good news is that Jesus sacrificed, another financial term, so that we could have peace with God, and we have received the free gift of grace and mercy. All of that is kind of economic in its language. It's economic in its language, but it is deeply heartfelt in its intent, because we've been rescued from those things. And Jesus has triumphed over anxiety, and he's triumphed over pride. And I know this because money cannot make us holy. Jesus has. Money cannot deal with your shame and guilt, and Jesus has. Money cannot give you meaning, purpose. Jesus has. Money cannot give you identity and security. Jesus has. As a Jesus follower this morning, the thing that you have is the most precious thing, and you have it in abundance. It is by God's grace you have been saved, and that a gift of God so that no one should boast. Pride says, I've got this, I'm in charge, I'm in control, I don't need anything. Anxiety says, I'm not good enough, I'm not sufficient, I can't handle this, what's going to happen? And Jesus experienced physical poverty when he was on earth. He didn't live in a castle. Scripture tells us that he didn't even have a home. He stayed in the homes of friends, and he said, foxes have holes, but I don't even have, the Son of Man doesn't have a place to lay his head. He experienced real poverty when he walked this earth. He experienced the height of anxiety in the garden when he was praying, and he said to God, not my will, but yours be done. Such anxiety that he sweated blood. And then in the moment when he died, the pride of the centurion was broken, where the centurion looks up and says, surely he was the Son of God. And that moment of anxiety and of surrender to God brought about a moment that shattered the pride of humanity and said, truly, this is the Son of God. Mercy Commons, let's come to him with open hands. Let's come to him with open hearts. Let's let go of whatever we're gripping with our white knuckles, whether it's pride or fear. And let's release that to the good pleasure of our Father, because he cares for us. Let's stand and sing.